This is the Neoliberal Around podcast. Recording. Welcome back to Caribbean Thought. This is class 2. Of course, the assignment for last week was, and if I could go back to it, is there a paradigm to Caribbean thought and Caribbean studies, one that is Afrocentric within Caribbean academia? Read Amamazama's The Afrocentric Paradigm and answer the question in your review of the Afrocentric Paradigm. The article is available online. Now, so is there a paradigm to Caribbean thought and Caribbean studies? Or can there be one that is Afrocentric within Caribbean academia? And then when you read Amamazama's Afrocentric Paradigm, she talks about Afrocentricity, but then she moves beyond just talking about Afrocentricity as a tradition. She doesn't talk about it as a tradition or just as a or as a worldview. She doesn't see Afrocentricity as a worldview like that of the Eurocentricity. It's a worldview, but one that exposes itself as a dominant culture over all. She doesn't look at Afrocentricity in a sense as a superior worldview. She doesn't see Afrocentricity as that, but she goes beyond just seeing it as a worldview and looking at it as a paradigm. Even within academia, in terms of how we frame things. Do we have what? And then of course we ask, is there an Afrocentric framework or a Eurocentric framework within which education takes place? Now, the homework is important, the assignment is important, and it's important because, and I'm reading the Afrocentric Manifesto written by Molefi Ashanti, and he makes a very important point. There's in chapter 6, the Afrocentric idea in education. And in it, he says, in education, Afrocentricity means that one provides students with the opportunity to begin study of the world, its people, concepts, and history from the point of view of the African child's heritage. Thus, the African child is not an object, but a subject. No discipline of knowledge is alien to the African person from this perspective. Whether the subject is biology, medicine, literature, or social studies, the African student is centered in the reality of that discipline so that he or she is not seen as having to get it, but rather being a part of it. This is important. What is necessary is a pedagogy that has interrogated African cultures and experiences for best practice. As far as I'm concerned, centricity is one avenue for seeking best practice. Centricity is the process of locating a student within the context of his or her own cultural reference in order to be able to relate to other cultural perspectives. This is very important. Let me read it again. Centricity, and of course, as you read the Afrocentric paradigm and the idea of Afrocentricity, it is centering the African. It is centering the African. And that is very important. The recentering, relocating, and reorienting the African or the individual. Because colonization decentered and misappropriated the African away from his culture, so that the African looks within himself and within his culture with disdain. So the idea of centering is important, and even within education, because education is fundamentally a social phenomenon. It consists in socializing in people. And so I like what Molefi Ashanti says here, that centricity is the process of locating the student within the context of his or her own cultural reference. What is our cultural reference in the Caribbean? Or what has been our cultural reference or our school of thought? What has been our cultural reference or our school of thought? What narratives dominate our perspectives? What narrative dominate our studies? Quite interesting. So therefore, the Afrocentric paradigm or Afrocentricity, in a sense, it helps to center the student within the context of his or her own cultural reference in order to be able to relate to other cultural perspectives. And then he goes on to say that European slave trade concentrates on what the whites were doing instead of the resistance of the Africans. In such a world, the African student is always acted upon, but seldom shows to be an actor. Acted upon as against an actor. So centricity must be practiced in such a way that students from various cultures see themselves as participating in the flow of information and knowledge. So, and that is why it's important, I think it is important to begin thinking about Afrocentricity and the Afrocentric paradigm, because the Afrocentric paradigm provides a way of thinking, a cosmological and axiological and epistemological way of seeing the world, one that is rooted within our center, a particular reference. And we'll get to that later, hopefully throughout this class. And but by the way, one student wrote in terms of their definition of Afrocentric, and you might have seen my response to you. And I said that, I said to you, no, that's not what Afrocentricity is, because I said Afrocentricity is a quality of thought, practice, and perspective that perceives Africans as subjects and agents of phenomena acting in their own cultural image and usual and human interests. And that's very important. Again, Afrocentricity is a quality of thought, but we'll talk some more about that. But welcome to Caribbean Thought again, and we will delve into that. We're gonna review the syllabus today. We're gonna go over it, and then after we go over the syllabus, hopefully we'll get some chance to begin talking about the Afrocentric paradigm. We may not be able to finish all the discussions about that today because we're gonna look at it's gonna take me about an hour to go through the syllabus. Once we're finished going through the syllabus, we'll take a break and then we will begin to look at Afrocentricity as against Eurocentricity, and whether and what that says of Christianity, and define some very key concepts. We'll do that today. But before we do that, there are some students who are coming in for the very first time who never got a chance to introduce themselves to the class. We want to provide an opportunity for that. So somebody said something ended the last class with a point, actually. Somebody ended last week's class, and I actually wanted to raise that. And by the way, when I asked you to read Afrocentric Paradigm by Amma Mazama and to reflect on the idea of whether there can be or should be a paradigm that is Afrocentric to the study of Caribbean, what I'm doing here is powerful because I'm not merely teaching Caribbean history. I'm interrogating the frame through which the Caribbean has been seen. I'm asking you, the students, to question the beginning itself. That is philosophical, or that is philosophy, that is epistemology. Why do you know what you know? That is epistemological. Philosophy is the search for truth. That is rebellion against inherited narratives. Because Columbus does not arrive first, perspective does. And so last week we introduced the course, which is Caribbean Thought. We did not simply introduce a syllabus or a list of readings. We introduced a way of thinking. We said that the course explores the currents that have shaped the Caribbean. Colonialism, slavery, migration, resistance, religion, capitalism, globalization, race, culture. But more importantly, we said that we would approach the Caribbean not merely historically, but sociologically, or historically or sociologically, but philosophically. It's a philosophical inquiry. We say that it's the Caribbean thought explores the currents that have come to shape the Caribbean, but it's a philosophical inquiry, and because we are attempting to reimagine how we study the Caribbean. And traditionally, the Caribbean has often been studied through European frameworks, or discovery, colonization, plantation economies, so on and so forth. And so we ask, who gets to define the beginning of the Caribbean history and Caribbean thought? And we say that the question matters, and that particular question is important because at the end of last week's class, one student, I don't remember who it was, said something important, and it's been on my mind all week. He said, I do not have a problem with starting with Christopher Columbus. Well, I have a problem with that. Okay? I have a problem starting with Christopher Columbus. I have a problem beginning with Columbus because beginning with Columbus centers Europe as the origin of Caribbean existence.
It was Hopton Thompson.
Hopton Thompson, I have a problem with that. It suggests that the Caribbean only became meaningful once Europe encountered it. But the Caribbean existed before Columbus. Peoples existed before Columbus. Civilizations existed before Columbus. Spiritual systems existed before Columbus. Ways of knowing existed before Columbus. And Africans did not only enter the Caribbean as enslaved people. Africans were sailors, travelers, traders, long before the transatlantic slave trade. To begin with Columbus is therefore not neutral. It is philosophical. It reflects a worldview. That is why the reading for today is so important. Go ahead. Yes?
Yeah, so I'm just thinking as you mentioned that I would say the reason why we could draw from that understanding is because that we were taught a certain way, and I believe it started recorded, or things started to be recorded after Columbus visited and leave and them something. So we really don't know what the people them did do before Columbus. Cause
no, but we do know.
No, but we do know.
We do know. Who said that? Yes, answer him for me, please. Answer him. Answer him for me. No, wait, Opton. I love that.
I'm not disputing it, sir, but I'm saying it started recording after.
No, but we have information about the Taínos, the Arawak Indians before Christopher Columbus. I mean, I am a before Christopher Columbus person because
All right.
it was their but because of how they lived and their ways,
Right.
you know, they were slave men and women basically. So
And you know, I tell you to read the Afrocentric, and we told it to. That's why we told you to read the Afrocentric paradigm because, okay. Oh, you're saying that there was no. Who told you that? The same people who were saying that they discovered the stuff.
No, I'm not saying nothing. I say I can understand why.
And you are going to trust Christopher Columbus? Oh, there nothing existed before I came. That is a supremacist way. Wait, Horton. That is a supremacist way of thinking. Nothing existed before we came. History wasn't being recorded before I came. That is a Eurocentric supremacist position to say that nothing existed before and no recording existed before. I mean, when people steal something, that's what they're going to say as well, yes? Yes, in order to protect their ill-gotten gain, in order to protect their what they have stolen. And not only that, they're going to corrupt the history of it, which is okay. They corrupt it, and we're going to talk a little bit about that, which I'm so happy you're here. Yes, Oreen has his hand up, as well as Kaye.
Cave. Right,
Kave.
sir. So I'm saying that contrary to what such man just said, can't remember his name. My apologies.
Hope the
It
people
was
might attach you
recorded.
to them on.
It was recorded. It was recorded, and all you have to do is just do a little bit of reading. It was recorded. We know their systems. We know their beliefs. We know how they looked. We know how they dressed. We know a lot. So it is not it's not factual to say that history began its recordings when Christopher came here. There are many persons that did their research, did their writings. It's just for us to tap into that black and white and get the information.
Thank you. Yes. And any serious inquiry into the Caribbean must reckon with history, because the Caribbean also connects to a past, a present, and future, and must consider where and when Caribbean history and its people begin. Okay? So where does Caribbean history begin? With the Taino and other indigenous people, with Columbus and European conquest, with the transatlantic slave, with African survival in the Americas, with emancipation, with independence. Of course, well, if you read the Afrocentric paradigm focuses on a position of victory than oppression. That is one of the most important thing about the Afrocentric paradigm. It centers you, and it helps us to view as the subject, not to begin our history with conquest. Yes. So to begin with Columbus is really a defeatist position. It is a defeatist position. Our existence did not begin with Europe's gaze, and in order to recenter, we must reorient ourselves to the true history where we are actors. Our history must begin with us. This, therefore, it challenges not just our chronology, but our epistemology. The way, because if you said history, because that was where record began, then there becomes an issue of epistemology. How do we know what he wrote is true? And we talk about history means his story. The very way knowledge and civilizations are framed have to be to begin Caribbean history with Christopher Columbus is to accept Europe as the point of origin, the narrator and the validator of existence. It positions the Caribbean as discovered rather than lived, encountered rather than inhabited, passive rather than creative. What we are arguing here, Hopton, is that history must not begin with intrusion, but with being. The Caribbean did not emerge into existence in 1492. The people of the Caribbean, which includes the Taino people, the Kalinago people, the Siboney with African presence and others, possess cosmologies, systems of exchange, spirituality, agriculture, navigation, art, language, and philosophy long before Europe stumbled into onto the Caribbean. And to start with Columbus is to, and I don't think, and he didn't stumble. There was no stumbling. As I said to you, hopefully we get a chance to look to review. I don't have the book up here. It's downstairs. African presence in the Caribbean. Ivan Van Septima wrote about that in his book, and I shared it with you last week. It's in the reading list. But he talks about African presence in the Caribbean, and there were African sailors coming here. The people, the American Indian, the Taino people, Siboney, all these people that were here, they interacted with the African sailors that were coming here. Some of them stayed in the Caribbean and intermingled and shared arts. That's why, you find African presence here in the Caribbean long before the Europeans arrived. They were here interacting with the people, and the Europeans learned of the West Indies through their interaction with the Africans, which brought them here. And of course, later they oppressed them. So to start with Columbus is to unconsciously reinforce the colonial proposition that nothing meaningful existed before Europe observed it. If it's not created by a European, it's not created. It's that kind of thinking. I think it was Edward Said in his book Orientalism talks about when England or when Europe had colonized Kemet, which they changed into Egypt, they said that Balfour in the 1600s was defending British presence in Egypt, the colonization, and he was saying that nothing, Egypt depends and need Britain. Nothing valuable is created unless we impose upon it, and if anything valuable and anything outside of their colonization was created, it's still not according to them but some other history. It suggests, and if you read the Afrocentric paradigm, that is the distinction between Eurocentricity and Afrocentricity, because Eurocentry poses itself as universal. Eurocentrism or Eurocentricity imposes itself as universal and supreme. It's not discovered until the white man discovered it. That's not true. Okay, so we will not start with Columbus. To start with Columbus is to unconsciously reinforce the colonial proposition that nothing meaningful existed before Europe observed it. That is the old poison of Eurocentrism dressed in the robes of history. So, and that's very important. And I want to make the point about Frantz Fanon, who wrote the book Wretched of the Earth. Frantz Fanon is a very important, and if you're studying psychology or social work, I hope you get a chance to study Frantz Fanon, because he's the first one that really introduced the psychological aspect of colonization. He introduced and combed the psychoanalytic theory to the colonized. In psychology or in social work, it's, of course, part of what you do in social work is looking at the psyche of people. And Frantz Fanon is a very important frame, although he was still considered not to be Afrocentric, but he is still part of Afrocentrism, the tradition. Some of you read my paper in academic.edu. I saw that. Thank you so much, where I talk about Afrocentrism as against Afrocentric, as against Afrocentricity. But Frantz Fanon is not believed by many Afrocentrists as being Afrocentric, because he was still within the milieu of this white supremacist mode. He was a Marxist who embraced European, who believed that white people created race. And as if Africans never had a race or never had race, and as if there was never had history. But Fanon believes that we never had history, or it would seem so, as he would not say we must begin a new history of man, as he tried to move away from a history of corruption and colonization. I said later on in the class we're going to look at the timeline of the Caribbean. But in 1944, the United Nations came together, and that's when they started the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. They started a new world order, which would continue white supremacy. But in 1944, and in 1944, none of the colonies were present in 1944 because it was just the colonizers, the colonizing countries. But in 1955, when they had the Bandung Conference, all the colonized countries came together to talk about their freedom and their independence. And from 1955 up to the 1960s, you have the Revolutionary Wars for independence, where all the colonies were fighting for their independence. You have the Algerian and the Liberation Wars, and Frantz Fanon was caught up into that, and then he got ill, and by 1960 he's from Martinique, and but by the 1960s, when many countries were getting their independence, he wrote kind of as a manifesto. He says we must begin a new history of man as we think about our independence, and many countries were negotiating their independence. He said we must start a new history of man as tabula rasas. But of course, people like Molefi Ashanti and Amamazama had a problem with Frantz Fanon. They believe that that's wrong to say that, because of course he's a Marxist. Many Afrocentrists don't embrace Marxism because Marxism is a European idea it's a European idea of politics, which moves it. So they don't believe he was Afrocentric, but he's appreciated. But he talks about we must begin a new history of man as tabula rasas. We're going to talk about Frantz Fanon later on in the course. As I said to you, this is the first class where we're introducing some of these concepts. But he was within a European milieu, although he meant well. There was an experience outside of the European way of life, one that provides a unique understanding of life that is connected to the people. We never needed to get rid of. So I made a note of this earlier. Fanon writes in The Wretched of the Earth, we must begin a new history of man. The colonized people as tabula rasas. Tabula rasa means a blank slate. He was speaking of the newly formed nations in the 1960s when many of the colonies were becoming independent. But why must we begin a new history of man? We already have a history. We already have a frame from which to speak. We already have culture. But Fanon was writing within a European milieu. Although he was revolutionary, he was not revolutionary enough. He still was without agency. He was decentered and disoriented. He was confused about the history of the African, as if our history had no value, because we don't need a new history. We already have a history. We just need to develop a frame. We just need to expose ourselves to that history. That history, that frame, that worldview, that center, that African center. We don't, okay, so, and of course, Amamazama talks about that. That is the idea that Mazama drives home about Afrocentricity, or the Afrocentric paradigm. We will talk about Frantz Fanon later in the course, and the book that he wrote, Wretched of the Earth. I still like Frantz Fanon, although Amamazama and Molefi Ashanti levied a harsh criticism of Frantz Fanon. He wrote Black Skins, White Mask, and he also wrote The Wretched of the Earth. I hope and we want to delve into that a bit. But it's a profound distinction. But the Caribbean experience did not begin with conquest. Conquest interrupted an already existing world. The spiritual relationship to land and sea and ancestry, community. The Caribbean before Europe carried rhythms and reciprocity and communalism, and so on and so forth, and we'll get into that. So that it's very important to note. Okay, Europe called it the New World, but it was already new. It was only new to Europe. The Caribbean didn't suddenly awake in 1492. Okay, the islands were already breathing civilization. So our framing aligns strongly with our framing. Notice that word. Our framing aligns strongly with Afrocentric and decolonial approaches that seek to relocate historical consciousness away from colonial validation. To say that to start with Columbus is to give Europe validity over our own validation. It echoes the critique that colonial education teaches colonized people to view themselves through the eyes of the colonizer, beginning with Columbus. Beginning with Columbus, trained students to unconsciously see Europe as the center of motion and the Caribbean as merely reactive terrain. Yeah, that's why many people disagree with Norman, is it Gervin in the Caribbean Reader? He says the Caribbean is an invention. The Caribbean is an invention. And like, in one sense, I used to believe that it was an invention, but in another sense, it is not an invention because it is a defeatist position. The damage done to the former colonized subject did not end with formal emancipation. It left behind, yes, a legacy of dismemberment, but there is a legacy, there's roots, okay? And so that's very important to note. But I'm going to, anyways, I didn't need to go into all of that, but I had to say that because Hopeton, I've been thinking about this all week. I wrote an article. Okay. I wrote an article about it. That the Caribbean as part of the totality of life must critically reflect on its position in life and society. Okay, but anyways, that's that. I didn't mean to go into that rant. We want to move beyond that. But it's quite interesting that the Caribbean was able, if we can look at, was able to preserve itself in many different ways. How was the Caribbean able to preserve itself? What does resistance look like? I'm interested to know about that. The resistance of the Caribbean in spite of the invasion of the Europeans. Because our music, our culture, our dance, faith, how were we, that's very important. That is what worth studying and knowing. How were we able to preserve, the Caribbean able to preserve themselves in spite of colonization? Because again, colonization is the stripping away of one's humanity. Colonization is to reorient. Sorry, colonization is decentering us. This is very important in terms of, Amamazama said, if I could find it here, Amamazama said, in her book Afrocentric Paradigm, she explains that Afrocentricity is not merely a worldview, nor even a theory as such, but rather it is a paradigm that results in the reconceptualization of the social and historical reality of African people. Reconceptualization of the social and historical reality of the African people. Actually, what she suggests is that the Afrocentric paradigm is a revolutionary shift in thinking proposed as a constructural adjustment to Black disorientation, decenteredness, and lack of agency. Colonization decentered us, took away our agency, yes, and reoriented us. So now we are all white, but we can never be truly white. How were we able? And then again, so as I said to you, in terms of our education, what our education look like? Our education look like should, as I said to you, I like what Malafia Shanti said earlier in terms of focus on the Afrocentric idea in education. In education, Afrocentricity means that one provides students with the opportunity to begin study of the world, its people, its concepts, history from the point of view of the African. The African is not an object but a subject. No discipline of knowledge is alien to the African person from this perspective. Whether it is biology, psychology, medicine, social work, literature, social studies, the African student is centered in the reality of that discipline so that he or she is not seen as having to get it. That's Molefi Ashanti. But rather being part of it. So centricity is the process of locating a student within the context of his or her own cultural reference in order to be able to relate to other cultural perspectives. So within the Caribbean, what has been our education? Has it been, we got our independence, but we still inherited colonial values, which cause us to look down on ourselves and our people if they speak a certain way, if they look a certain way, or if if they practice revivalism, if they practice Rastafarianism. Well, how do we view if they don't speak English very well? If you speak English very well, then you are celebrated. We talk about elitism within cultures. We have created an elitist culture within the Caribbean as well. And the elitism is based on your assimilation. If you have adopted or adapted a particular culture that is closer to that of Europe or that of Britain, then you are more elite. Okay, you are more elite. So even that within that supremacist culture, but we'll talk a little bit about that. But that's very important. So that's why I asked you guys to read Afrocentric Paradigm. It's very important that we begin here, a frame. Talking about a perspective of so as we begin to look at the Caribbean, our history, our culture, the currents that have come to shape the Caribbean, of what's our frame, what's our center, as we begin to understand who we are as individuals. Are we actors, or historically, how far divorced are we from our original selves? Afrocentricity contends that our main problem as African people is our usual unconscious adoption of the Western worldview and perspective and their attendant conceptual framework. Again, Afrocentricity. So this is how Afrocentricity provides that. What is our problem? What is our problem? And by the way, I was reading. Wow, I'm sure I was reading Molefi Ashanti and Afrocentric Manifesto. And by the way, if you read, if I'm asking you to read something, you wanna find out. The first thing you want to ask is, who is Amamazama? Where is she from? What are her influences? Why is she writing in such a way? Who is Ronaldo Mackenzie? Why is he teaching the way he teaches? Where is he from? What are his influences? What is his struggle? So, when you ask to interact with a piece of literature as academics, the first thing you ask, if I ask to read The Wretched of the Earth, first, who is the author of The Wretched of the Earth? after the Afrocentric paradigm, who is the author of the Afrocentric paradigm? Yeah, we're talking about Ama Mazama, but of course, she's not. There's also Molefi Ashanti, who talked about the Afrocentric paradigm. Okay, and then before that, there is also, we know about W.E.B. Du Bois and these other persons that have contributed to the tradition of Afrocentrism, that is Afrocentrism. There's Pan-Africanism, which is different from Afrocentricity. Pan-Africanism is a part of Afrocentricity, but it's a little bit different, and we can define that. But as I asked to read the Afrocentric paradigm, the question is, who is the author? Who is Ama Mazama? That's a very important question. Who is Ama Mazama? And of course, and I wanted to address Ama Mazama, and Molefi Ashanti talks about Ama Mazama. He said Ama Mazama, and this is how, and Ama Mazama actually was my professor. And I actually did the course, the Afrocentric paradigm, at Temple University while I was working on my PhD in Afrocology. And Ama Mazama was my professor, very good friend of mine. We touched base together. We did some projects, one project together in terms of, we had a conference that she asked me to do. So I know of Ama Mazama. I know she's a practitioner. She's a practitioner in terms of African faith, a particular tradition, but we'll talk about that a little bit. But he begins like this: Ama Mazama is an African. That's the first thing. Ama Mazama is an African. Who is Ama Mazama? Ama Mazama is an African. Now, what do we mean by that, though? Ama Mazama was not born in Africa, of course. I think she was born in the Caribbean, Guadeloupe or Martinique, but she grew up in Guadeloupe. Okay, and she probably lived in. I don't think she lived in Martinique. I think she grew up in Guadeloupe. Frantz Fanon is from Martinique, so these are Caribbean, but Guadeloupe was a French colony. Martinique was a French colony. But Ama Mazama says Ama Mazama is an African. So it speaks to the center. Where is her center? Her center is African. Who is Ronaldo Mackenzie? Ronaldo is an African who was born a Jamaican citizen, a British citizen in Jamaica. Anyways, Ama Mazama, I love, if I were to ask you, who are you? How do you begin? Where do you begin? In terms of what is your location? The Afrocentric paradigm or the Afrocentricity tries to relocate, recenter and relocate. Location is a very important concept in Afrocentricity. Where is your location? Where is your frame? Again, I keep saying that. Ama Mazama says, so Ama Mazama is an African. So her center is Africa. It's an African who was, and by that, and of course she said, that is, being born in Africa doesn't necessarily mean you are Afrocentric. Wearing African clothes doesn't mean you're Afrocentric, because you could be a white person wearing African garb. You could be from South Africa. That doesn't necessarily mean you are Afrocentric. Okay? Ama Mazama is an African who was born a French citizen in Guadeloupe, educated at the Academy of the Antilles in Guadeloupe, Bodor, and La Sorbonne, where she obtained a PhD with highest distinction in linguistics. She became a professor in African American Studies at Temple University, and right now she is the chair for the Africology department. After making professorial stops at University of Texas and Howard University, Georgetown, Penn State, growing up as she did in the intellectual environment of French philosophical and linguistic studies, but with the political and social radicalization of the Guadeloupean and Martinican campaigners for autonomy, I think she grew up at a time like that of Fanon when there were the Revolutionary War for independence. Mazama reacted to colonial indoctrination. Mazama reacted to colonial indoctrination that suggested the superiority of European culture over African culture. She reacted to colonial indoctrination that suggested the superiority of European culture over African culture. No one could convince her that the language of the black people of Guadeloupe was simply bad French, nor could they influence her to believe that the Congo-based language of the people was inferior to any other language. Let's talk about the idea of Creole, or patois in Jamaica, or Louise Bennett. Louise Bennett in Jamaica. Louise Bennett, when she did her shows and write her poetry, she would utilize patois. Yes? And she promoted that as her resistance, as her violence, as her resistance, as her reaction to the indoctrination that suggested the superiority of European culture over African culture. So, like Mazama or like Louise Bennett, who they appreciated and saw the language of the patois as not bad language. In fact, it is our language. It comes from our center. It is the patois that the Jamaicans speak and the languages speak. The way we speak it is, oh, you don't speak well. You don't speak English well. Or, oh, you speak English well when you're able to disavow a certain way of speaking and you embrace your English well. Then you're said, oh, yes, you speak well. But Mazama was against that. She didn't believe. She embraced she wouldn't call it Creole, because to say Creole or to say patois, it is as if what we speak is not a language. What we speak is not valuable. So we said, oh, the main French, English, and Spanish, those are languages. And if you don't speak those, then you speak something else. And if you speak patois or broken English, but that kind of broken is a resistance, and it comes from a long line of history where we continue to maintain a kind of language that we inherit from our center, that we brought with us, that still exists in some form today. That language still exists in some form today. That broken English, that patois, it's the way that it still exists. When you hear some like Saint Vincent and Grenadian speak, or Trinidadian, they have this rhythm to it. The Caribbean, when we speak with a certain kind of rhythm. It's a carryover from who we were and who we are, and that we have nourished and kept with us. And still with a little bit of the European flavor that we have. But the idea is not for us to have that. They want you to completely disavow your language and to embrace and to assimilate in European culture. So that's quite interesting. But Ama Mazama, no one could convince her that the language of the black people of Guadeloupe was bad French. She don't believe in bad English or bad French, or the language of the Jamaican people was bad English or the broken. She don't believe in that. They could not influence her to believe that the Congo-based language of the people was inferior to any other language. The Jamaican language is not inferior to any other language. It's quite important. And in so doing, she establishes in her sustained argument that the point that the Guadeloupans were not merely imitators of French, nor were they trying to speak French. They were speaking a language that had its roots deep in the continent. Deep in the continent. they were not Creole, and there was no real Creole identity. There's no real Creole identity. Also, which is a very important, Mazama was laying the foundation for her future work in Afrocentricity theory already by the time she was getting her first master's degree, blah, 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 so on and so forth. By the way, I've asked the
But
urban.
sir,
Go ahead.
can I enter here? So you said something just now about the language.
Yeah.
But I learned something recently.
Mm-hmm.
I learned something recently. I was in a meeting, and it was with a Ugandan parliamentarian member, and another colleague and I were having a conversation, and he was looking at us weird, and I asked him if everything was okay. And the first thing he asked was, how did I learn his old language? And I said, I don't understand you. We're just speaking Jamaican patois. He said, no, but a lot of the words that you just used are part of our dead language. And that's when he shared that during colonization over, I think, over 200 or 2,000 languages were lost.
Yes.
But then when we started having the conversation during lunch, I learned throughout members, sorry, I learned from different members within the group that, and then he started sharing other materials as well, that the Jamaican patois is a mixture of old languages from some of the other countries, specifically Uganda, Nigeria, Ghana, and so forth, that we find that a lot of the languages remain the same. And a colleague, she's Kenyan, and she said to me that I've always told you that the language is very similar to ours because there are times when she's speaking Swahili and I do understand her. I may not understand all the words that are the language or the words rather, but there I would be able to say to her, like, she was speaking something recently about her son and not feeling well, and I said, I hope your son feels better soon. And she said, Kenyatta, how do you know that? And I said, because you just said it earlier. And she said, that's what I'm telling you. Our language are the same. And I have met Ugandans who have said the same. I've met Ghanaians who have said the same. But one of the biggest challenge that I've seen is that European French, they're arguing that the Quebecans here in Canada are not the original speakers of French, and what they're speaking are really the wrong version of French, and that they should be adopting to the European way of French. But what another colleague of mine, who is also a history professor, said to me was that the Quebecans lead more to the African countries who speak French and adopt their language more because they believe that that's the original language. So when you said that just now and that, there's no way where it come from that little conversation that I had, I gathered that our language was pulled together for whatever possible reason it may be. We can assume, but history, world colonization and slavery. But that's how they communicated. But just to share that.
Yeah, that's a profound point.
Combination of the different traditional language that were spoken. Because when you said to me that you're speaking a language that is dead in my country, that died years ago, how do you know that? And I was like, I don't know what you're talking about.
But it's not dead. It's alive. It's still deep within us. It's still deep within us. It's still there. And there are ways how the plantation society was organized, they still found a way to preserve their language in some ways. Yes? Go ahead. Yes, so it's a mix-up of Twi. Twi language is also part of that Kenyatta. Twi as well. Which it's another kind of language with a little bit of locals. So yeah, and that is what So the language is not dead. We are able to over the years preserve that, and that's why it's so important to study language. I'm a Mazama, studied language, and so on and so forth. But of course, the way in which we view language today, in term, it's quite interesting. The better you are at speaking a certain language or speaking a certain way, then the more respected you are. But Amamazama was against that. And but anyway, she continues. So that's where Amamazama is coming from, and she came to the U.S. and so on and so forth. But Amamazama work followed her work as a. Sorry, let me just continue reading. Let me just move on to see where she's. Mazama's argument for Afrocentricity is therefore grounded in practical and intellectual experiences. She has both philosophical and linguistic training. Her approach to the same general problem of African dislocation will be slightly different from others. Which is so African dislocation is one of the things that we talk about in Afrocentricity, and we're trying to get back to locate the African. So if we were to outline Amamazama's argument, colonization of Africans has not ended. This is her argument. Although colonization of Africans has not ended, Africans are still mentally subjugated. Again, if we were to outline, this is Amamazama's argument as outlined by Molefi Ashanti in the Afrocentric Manifesto. Although the colonization of Africans has not ended, Africans are still mentally subjugated. The reason for this sad mental state is that we have been fighting against the evil of colonization as an economic and political problem, rather than a total conceptual disorientation leading to confusion. That's very important. That's very important. And of course, confusion. That is why Amamazama Amolefi Ashanti talks about Frantz Fanon as being confused, because he's writing that the colonized must begin we must begin a new history of man as we negotiated our independence as tabula rasa, as a blank slate, as if we don't already have a history that we can reference. To develop and to continue the history of the new nation that we are trying to advocate for. The history of the new nations, of the new nations in the 1960s, as we start to fight for independence and as we start to negotiate our independence. He said that we should negotiate the independence on the terms of the white man. We should with violence take our independence and start a new nation. A nation that is separate and apart from what exists. But Amamazama and Molefi Ashanti is saying we already have a frame, a reference that is beautiful for us to develop, and we cannot divorce ourselves from our past. But
sir,
go ahead.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
But then you had on one side I think it was Malcolm X and Marcus Garvey who believed that we should return as all Black people, no matter where you are, return to your homeland, wherever that is in Africa. But then you have like these theories now, and from what you're sharing is saying that I guess this is why everyone is really confused these days, in my opinion, because do we return home or do we stay where we are now? Because we have like planted DNA roots in the various parts of the globe, and started over one thing. Are we saying that we should not?
Well, I mean, Marcus, they're writing. At the time when they were writing like that,
build roots where we are versus like returning back. So like all of these great leaders had hold different views, world views on colonization, slavery. Everyone had a different view.
Yeah. But we have to
So,
return. Okay, you can where you are now.
but
I
even
mean,
where we are now,
in
we're
the
still being
1800s,
told. Go
and
ahead, sir.
the 1800s was different from, and the early 1900s is different from where we are now in the world. Of course,
Mhm.
we still have racial disparities. We still live in societies where African Americans and Black people throughout the world, wherever you are, is demonized and terrorized and so on and so forth. Which, but at the same time, the world has is not it's not as the world has developed in a sense in the 21st century. So they wanted to return back to Africa, yes, but I don't think, and I think that returning back to Africa may not have been bad. Go back, but they don't. Who wants to? They would not want us to go back to Africa, anyways. This is a lot of tradition. A lot of we would leave with the culture, with ideas, with a lot of African Americans and Black people throughout the world have money. Okay, now they're not. They don't. It's not. The idea is not to leave. But I think the idea is a mental entrapment, an appreciation for self, the development of agency. Return back to Africa in a sense is different. We don't have to go back to Africa today. We can go back to Africa where we live wherever we are now. Okay, so, and that's important to point out. And again, the problem is that our worldview, our frame, and acceptance of self and how one accepts self. That's the most important thing right now. I don't think. Well, I live in Jamaica. I mean, I live in the U.S. and Africans have always traveled. Okay, and they will take Africa with them. So I don't think the people in Africology would talk about going back to Africa. The issue is an appreciation for self, an appreciation over allowing external worldviews to dominate one ideas about self, how you view the world, how you view oneself. So that's the most important thing now. But I don't think the goal is to go back to Africa. I don't, it's in the 21st century. I don't think that will suffice. But at the same time, Africa is growing. Africa is developing. There's some part of Africa that is amazing and beautiful. There's some people have gone back to Africa to make a life. There's a lot of Jamaica. I think there's an African country. Where is it? Where you have a lot of Jamaicans living there. Yeah, go ahead.
You're talking about in Ghana, but I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that. I didn't ask a question on the basis that whether we should go, but I'm just looking at it from all the world, like a lot of historical writers, researchers, and philosophers within the Black community would have so many different views on Black people, our history, our culture, and what we're supposed to do, or the view of what we're supposed to do. I do understand Afrocentric this piece because it's something that has always been in my life based on my grandfather. My grandfather is Kenyan, right? And I don't even have to say to persons that I don't have to tell persons my name for them to pick up or give that background to, I don't want to say roots, but yeah. But it's, I'm just trying to catch a view on it as to.
Yeah, but I understand what you're trying to say. I think
is the expectation now as us as Black people, especially in times like these, as we can definitely see on social media and the news, the Americans are there's definitely a huge conversation or a silent but loud conversation happening as it relates to the definition of African American. Right? Do you identify as African American because you're Black, but you've never been to Africa? How do you still identify as this? And we're seeing where a lot of persons are confused now in times like these as it relates to their Blackness and connecting it back somewhere or to something. And someone recently said it beautifully that we, as Black people, we ought to start defining for ourselves individually or as a group, however that looks for you, right? Because this is where confusion comes in, and that is causing a lot of identity crisis for Black people, right? Because, for example, I have a cousin, light skin, but she goes that extra mile so that person's, but she goes to that extra mile and she will tell you directly. I can call her on the phone and she'll tell you that it's easier for her to, a person not to try to assume that she's automatically Black or from a Black background identity wise, but assume like they have to ask her. She prefer when they ask. She goes through those lenses to make sure that persons ask, where are you from? Are you Black? Are you white? Are you Puerto Rican? Tell me. Are you mixed? Whatever that looks like. So just asking the question.
And that's fine, but that is why some people advocate for education. And that's why we need. She talks about. Amamazama talks about that what constitutes the Afrocentric paradigm. She talks about epistemology, metaphysics, and axiology, and exemplars. She talks about training and development, and that is because we are so far removed, we are confused about our reference point. So there is something about the African that where there is a shared connection that we have, a connectedness. In the 1980s, many Africologists were changing their names, so that's why you have Malafia Ashanti, Check, Diop, Amamazama. They had other names, but in order to embrace the ones that validate oneself as over any other, then they were embracing other. They were changing their names and taking on African names, so as to begin to refocus and to recenter and to reframe themselves. So, of course, it's very important to have training and to expose oneself to African values, African cultures, and because what we have, we are more exposed to European studies, European frames about ourselves. And so that's why it's very important to begin to start reading Diop, Molefi Ashanti, Amamazama, Karinga, that talks about the shared values, what connects us as African people, what was faith and religion like. Talk about those things are important. And of course, you don't have to, is a South African person Afrocentric? What is important in the Afrocentric paradigm is to occupy a position of victory over a position of defeat. It is to recenter one's frame, to start now thinking about Africa as an important location in one's worldview. That is what is important about the Afrocentric paradigm and about Afrocentricity. Over drawing one's point of view from Europe. I think that's what is important in the Afrocentric paradigm, in Afrocentricity and developing an outlook in life. And we're going to delve into that a little bit more. I see Yvette, I see Andre. Who wants, Yvette, go ahead. Yvette? Go ahead, Yvette.
Yes, sir. Good afternoon. Hear me? I was just making a suggestion earlier when you were talking about when somebody was saying that things weren't recorded, and I just wanted to say that my father traveled to many countries, and he was listening to you. It's like listening to my father all over again. In our earlier years, we used to feel embarrassed when our father used to talk about all that you're talking about. And when he came back to Jamaica one time, he bought a lot of books. You know, from the history of Africa. And you know what happened? They confiscated all that. It was a crate of books, and that was I think it was like in 1960 something. He came back to Jamaica and he brought a lot of books, and they were confiscated. They say that they wanted to charge him, say that he was bringing, it's not revolution was the word, and they said that they were going to investigate, and after that, because they could not charge him, and so what they did, they said they were going to investigate and then give him back, and he never ever saw all those books again. So I, in agreement to what you were saying, that yes, there were things, because I am born long after the 1960s. So if he brought all those books back to Jamaica, so persons would be aware of our African heritage, then yes, there must have been things written long before Christopher Columbus. That's my piece.
Thanks so much. And by the way, Kenyatta, I just want, when we talk about Afrocentricity, Afrocentricity exposes the cosmology, aesthetics, axiology, and epistemology of African culture. In other words, Afrocentricity is not simply about studying Africa, it is about understanding the world through African-centered ways of thinking. When you look at, Karinga talks about the cultural aspects of African characteristics, or African characteristics. She talks about there's a shared orientation or connectedness, the centrality of African community, respect for our tradition, a high level of spirituality and community. Society is important, veneration of the ancestors, the unity of being. Those things are important in terms of the African characteristics. And she goes a little bit further in the Afrocentric paradigm in defining the characteristics of the African. When we talk about cosmology, we're talking about how a people understand the universe, the existence, life, God, nature, and humanity's place within the world. So, Walter Rodney talks about how Europe underdeveloped Africa. Europe, the domination of Europe, the domination by Europeans or by the Western world is not necessarily just within the Caribbean, but even within Africa, even within many parts of Africa as well. In fact, because of the Ethiopia was not dominated by Europe, but in a sense it was, but in one sense it was not. That is why they were so poor, because of they weren't fully involved in the global world, because they refused that manipulation and domination from Europe, and so they were sidelined. It's as if there was an embargo on Ethiopia, and so that's why they struggled over the But it's very important to understand that. But part of Afrocentricity involves a cosmological outlook. It refers to how people understand the universe. Is it from a Eurocentric frame, a European frame, or is it from one that comes from our African worldview? Our existence of God. When we talk about the Obia, voodoo, I had a young woman. I was speaking with a young woman yesterday. She was born here, but her parents is from Haiti. I said, "Do you plan to go back to Haiti?" "Oh no!" And then, what do you think about voodoo? "Oh no, because this lady washed this girl here. This lady washed out her daughter's hair, and she died. So Haiti is bad, voodoo is bad." I said to the lady, "Well, where do you get that from?" And I said, the lady must the woman's daughter must have already been ill, and she was trying to save her, and probably so. But blood in people's hair can kill them. So where do you get that from? And I said to her that you understand. Her understanding of the universe, of existence, of life, of God, of nature, humanity, and humanity's place in the world, where does that come from? And within many African traditions, including the Caribbean, the universe is understood as interconnected. There is no strict separation between the spiritual and the material world. Ancestors, nature, community, and spirituality, they are all connected. How we understand the world, this differs from many Western traditions that often separate spirit from matter, religion from daily life, and humanity from nature. But the African, that was different. So that's the first thing. The second thing you need to know about, again, we said that Afrocentricity exposes aesthetics. Aesthetics refers to the ideas about beauty, expression, creativity, rhythm, music, art, and harmony. We don't have to go back to Africa, but as I said to you, our location, we keep within ourselves a history. We have history, and the African people sailed the world. Please remember, in the Africa people, they came to the Caribbean before the European do. But what exists today is a European understanding and our frame. But Africans were here, and they had, in fact, there were vestiges of Africa here, which they all but tried to wipe out, to refuse to say no, Africa wasn't here, and they kill off some people. They wiped out a whole generation of people because they are trying to make the point that, oh no, we were the first ones to come here. But Africans travel the world. Their influence is undeniable throughout the world, but they try to replace it with something else, with a bastardized version. So we don't have to go to Africa, I think, because their idea for their liberation, Malcolm X's liberation, Marcus Garvey's liberation, with a liberation ideology. In other words, he was talking about liberation. How can you free yourself from the domination, from colonization, from the violence of what exists in this world today, is by removing themselves from this context and going back to Africa, where probably you were well appreciated. But then they went back to Africa and something else happened. Some people weren't accepted because they still went back to Africa, but they went back to Africa with a European understanding of the world within Africa, and trying to now change Africa into what they have appreciated, a value that they have come to know. But anyways, we can talk about that later on, because even Marcus Garvey himself believed in a kind of supremacy, which is either good or bad, but still embraced white ideology and curry favor with and talked about the KKK. But we can talk about him another time. But when we talk about aesthetic, it refers to ideas about beauty, expression, creativity, rhythm, music, what we think as beautiful. Is it a European understanding of what is beautiful, or what we believe is beautiful? If you do your hair like this, oh, that's not professional. I impose, when my mom, of course, had a problem with doing at one time, my mom didn't accept me braiding my hair. But over time, I think, just before she died, she said, oh, I actually like it. But it is African. But you notice we live in a world where, oh no, our idea of beauty, African, that's Afrocentricity exposes aesthetics, refers to ideas about beauty, expression, creativity, rhythm, music. We find a thing in Jamaica where people are using throughout the Caribbean, the idea of colorism, or people are trying to change their skin tone so that they become browner or lighter. Go ahead.
Sir?
Yes.
Good night, everyone. A
Good
question,
night.
sir. Do you have a problem with a person taking a blood bath? You mentioned something regarding voodoo. What's your perspective on that? Someone taking a blood bath, saying that because of bad luck or they want better luck. What do you think about that, sir? Your perspective.
Well, I mean, if it's, I don't know, I don't know the art of voodoo. I don't know too much about voodoo. I know there is some blood is involved. They may have, I mean, the idea of blood, I believe, is an African tradition that has been incorporated within many European systems of faith, of worship, religion. Even the idea, and people believe that the idea of blood within Christendom stems from, it's an incorporation of the blood that Christians talk about is the same. That idea of blood is an African tradition that has been incorporated within Western traditions, in a bastardized way. Say, for example, praying the Catholic Church, praying to the dead. The praying to the dead was never part of Catholicism, but it was incorporated because Western societies took vestiges out of African traditions and incorporated within their traditions. So, of course, in terms of African traditions, there is a veneration of the ancestors, the importance of the ancestors. And of course, we talk about your mom and your dad die. You still say, "Oh, you." People talk about that. That comes from a tradition. In terms of bathing in the blood, I don't know much about that. I don't know if it's something that I would do. Okay, but I do not. I'm not going to critique. Look, I'm not going to be ethnocentric and look down upon somebody else's practice. But as an African person or Afrocentric person, that tradition seemed, if that's valuable to somebody, I'm not going to look down on it, on that practice. So my response to you is that, as someone who I'm not exposed to African tradition because I have been baptized in Eurocentricity and I'm now learning about African traditions and the value of that, it seems as if many people find value in that, and people like Nani of the Maroon find value in Obia, and many people find value in some traditions. But I don't know much about the blood, but it may be valuable to some people. So I'm not going to look down on the practice if they find value in that. But that's not something I practice. But however, I promote the blood. Okay, I do, the blood of Jesus.
Yeah, but
that blood comes from. Yeah.
But throwing something in about the whole voodoo Obia piece, a lot
Yeah.
of that started out as like a medical registry. If you should go to, and this is what I don't talk about this a lot. I think where you and I had a conversation about this in the past already with my grandfather, that there are a lot of things that I learned from him. For example, things that we currently view as wicked or evil in the Jamaican context of Obia, it was a medical. It was being done for medical purposes. For example, one that me and my cousins still talk about to this day is when they talk about the objects. Like if you can use an object to obey someone for wickedness or whatever. That was not the case actually in the practice. It was used more so as you're registered, because you weren't allowed to have a name as a slave because you were just associated with like a plantation. But in order to Reverend Aldo, that you would choose something, right? So your object might be a water bottle or the coconut tree blowing in your background. That might have been your object that you chose. So when you come to Kenyatta, because you're not feeling well, you would have to point out that is what I gave you. That's what I chose. You have to point at the coconut tree. I go to the coconut tree, and that's where I'll find all the oils, seeds, and everything that I would have given you based on your last treatment, right? So those are some of the stuff. And I think, is it Oxford? There's a university, I think it's Oxford now, that has a lot of that information. Now they're publishing a lot of that information on their online library platforms, the repository, I believe that's there. So how we're viewing a lot of the things as it relates to religion, Obia, black magic, all of that, it was actually for medical purposes. That's what I was taught. And the
Yeah.
literature from what I've seen like in the past also confirm that in some sense.
And but anyway, but the idea of blood could be a misconception. Just so you know, I mean, I'm not.
That's what I was about to say, that it can be a
Yeah,
misconception.
it's really for spiritual healing and so on. The idea of blood, I don't know if it's something that is used. Sometimes there's, as I said to you, that's just why many people need to be more exposed to these traditions. Sometimes there's false notions about them, and these false notions are created. I do not believe that the idea of the use of blood to bathe. I don't know about the blood, using blood to bathe someone in blood. I don't know where that comes from. So that is something, but I'm not a voodoo practitioner. My Ama Mazama is a voodoo practitioner. So she would know more. I probably could ask her, but I don't know. I don't believe that it is a practice of, I do not believe that it is a practice in Obi, but I know the use of blood in the sense that, sometimes they cut a chicken, I see they cut a chicken head and so on, but I don't know if they, and then of course, in Judaism, they talk about, putting the blood on the door, and then the angel would pass over that. Some of these things are African traditions which are incorporated within these narratives that never existed before. But the blood is important, but in terms of bathing somebody in blood, literally doing so, I'm not sure if it's something that if it's a voodoo practice. I've never. Where did you get that from? Hello?
Well, sir, I mentioned it based on what you mentioned earlier on with somebody washing somebody here with blood. So
No, they were
I
washing out
know
the blood.
that
Washing out the blood
persons.
out of the, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, washing out the blood.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah,
washing out the
but
blood.
I further went to talk about it because I know there are yes, that involve some sacrifice of a dove, a lamb, etc., etc. So I wanted to know if you are in favor with it or you are against the practice of obia then in general.
I mean, I've already said, I mean, I don't believe that obia should be made illegal in Jamaica. It's part of our African tradition. I believe, and I mean, by the end of this class, then you will know what my position is. I'm doing PhD research that looks at attitudes towards Afro-Caribbean beliefs, and the Jamaican government is thinking about legalizing obia. It was made illegal by the Europeans who colonized us, and it has been made to, and the idea about obia has been corrupted. Okay, so so that is something, as I said to you, is there a place for Christianity when you start to think about Afrocentricity and Eurocentricity? I've already asked that, I've already said that. So that is something for you guys to think about as we expose you guys to this class. And we will talk some more about it, but in some Christian traditions, in some traditions, say for example, in the revival tradition, they use obia in some Christian, in the revival church. So what does that mean? Are we going to be ethnocentric? Ethnocentric? Are we going to continue to use our European frame to make determinations about people's embrace of African traditions, of which we are of Africa? That's what I'm talking about. Where is your center? Where is your location? Is it Europe? Is it Europe or is it Africa? If your center is Europe, then yes, you will have a problem with African traditions. But if your center is African, then you don't have a problem. Part of colonization is to strip around is to take away any value of our traditions and to relocate you. Maybe I'm speaking in certain ways that is not clear. But as we begin, but and I haven't really delved into the class, which I want to delve into it really. But let me just finish making this point because I really want you guys to understand what we're saying and you don't miss the point. Where is that? Because I was talking about Afrocentricity, and Afrocentricity exposes the cosmology in terms of how a people understand the universe. It refers to aesthetics. It refers to epistemology of African culture. When you in studying Africa, it is about understanding the world through African-centered ways of thinking and being. African-centered. I talk about our education. Our education have socialized us to embrace a European way of seeing the world. So how you view Obia, how you view certain traditions, you view it from a Eurocentric way. Yes? But I said to you, Afrocentricity exposes the cosmology, aesthetics, axiology, and epistemology of African culture. In other words, cosmology refers to how people understand the universe, existence, life, God, nature, humanity's place in the world. Within many African traditions, the universe is understood as interconnected. There is no strict separation between the spiritual and the material world. Ancestors, nature, community, and spirituality are all connected. This differs from the Western traditions that often separate spirit from matter, religion from daily life, and humanity from nature. Aesthetics refers to ideas about beauty, expression, creativity, rhythm, music, art, harmony. African aesthetics often emphasize rhythm and communal participation and symbolism. There's a lot of symbolism within African traditions, even within certain Caribbean traditions that we haven't fully embraced because of our frame, spirituality. This is why music, dance, oral traditions, storytelling, and communal expressions that are so central within African and Caribbean cultures. The drum is not merely an instrument, it is memory, speaking. The Caribbean understood this well, which is why colonizers often fear drums more than speeches. A drum can organize a revolution. They didn't like the drumming. Drumming in some cultures were illegal. You cannot hit, drumming, and even with some churches that they call high church. Okay, they don't believe in drum. You can't play the drums in the church. It was feared by the white man, by the colonizers. Okay, and the third thing is axiological. Axiology refers to values and ethics. What a people consider good, moral, important, or worthwhile. Afrocentricity emphasizes values such as community, collective responsibility, respect for elders and ancestors, spirituality, harmony, and human interconnectedness. Even now, my mom died 2 years ago. My dad died in 2011. I say, hey, Mom, thank you for helping me out. I know it was you that helped me out. There is this, but we don't talk about it, but in passing, there's still something in us that we still connect with our ancestors in a sense, but we don't even realize what we're doing. Because in one sense, deep within, we still have this African, this thing within us where we appreciate our ancestors. But our European value teaches us not to appreciate that. But of course, now in Catholic Church, they pray to the dead. But it's not something that has always been around. Okay? And this is very important. Epistemology refers to the theory of knowledge, how we know what we know. How we know what we know. Afrocentricity argues that knowledge is not neutral. African people should not only learn through European categories and frameworks, but should also rely on African experiences, traditions, intuition, spirituality, our history, cultural memory as legitimate sources of knowledge, legitimate sources. Thus, Afrocentricity asks, who defines truth? Whose experiences are centered? Who has the authority to interpret reality? So when Amma Mazama says Afrocentricity exposes African cosmology, aesthetics, axiology, epistemology, she means that Afrocentricity seeks to restore African-centered ways of understanding reality, defining beauty, determining values, and producing knowledge. So therefore, for our conclusions in the Caribbean, for Caribbean thought, Mazama's work raises important questions. One, can Caribbean people define themselves outside of colonial categories? Can Caribbean identity exist outside of European frameworks? And do we have to go back to Africa? No. However, but can Caribbean identity, Rastafarianism, revivalism, the Pocomania, Obia, Voodoo, Santiri, reggae music, can Caribbean identity, in terms of our blackness and how we can our identity exist outside of European frameworks? Because those frameworks are institutional. The institutions that we have helps to maintain that, a certain framework. And then it's deeply interesting. What does it mean to center African experiences in Caribbean philosophy and history? What does it mean to center African experience in Caribbean? It's revolution. And I said earlier when we started, I said to you, the Afrocentric paradigm. Amamazama explains that Afrocentricity is not merely a worldview, nor even a theory as such, but rather it is a paradigm that results in the reconceptualization of the social and historical reality of African people. Actually, what she suggests is that the Afrocentric paradigm is a revolutionary shift in thinking. It's revolutionary. It's revolutionary shift in how we think. Can we afford to be revolutionary in today's age? I mean, then the next question we have to ask for this class is, how do religion, language, education, and politics continue colonial patterns of thought? That question is easy. If I were to ask you guys, how do religion and language and education and politics continue colonial patterns of thought? How we do politics is colonial. The political system we have is colonial. The Westminster system we talk about. We have the Westminster system throughout the Caribbean. Our education, as much as we have the CXC and CAPE, it's still inherited from GCE and European frame. We talk about even our language, the language we speak. We speak a language, but then if you speak English, you are praised, that you're great. But if you speak a certain other way, which if you more embrace broken English or a kind of patois, then you're looked down upon in certain places within the Caribbean. Yet when you come here and with other Americans, you're like they or in Canada, excuse me, oh, I love your accent. It's beautiful. And that's when you start pop it out and talk it. Anyways, but how do religion though? How does it continue colonial and religion? Whatever that looks like. I mean, that's interesting. These questions become central to understanding Caribbean identity, resistance, and consciousness. I just want to say that because I went straight to the bottom of my notes. Again, I said, I'm going to say this. What is the problem? Afrocentricity contends, this is our problem. Afrocentricity contends our main problem is African people our main problem as African people who are living in the Caribbean is our usual unconscious adoption of Western worldview and perspective and the attendant conceptual framework. That's a very important point. One of the things I was saying in the new book I'm writing, I talk about, let's look at this philosophical argument. Nothing black, no good. People of African descent are black. Therefore, African people are not good, or black people not good. Or Caribbean people are black. Therefore, Caribbean people not good. they are evil, or if they embrace their African traditions, it's evil. Obia is evil, because it's black, it's African. But if it's European, it's good. We accept that. If you speak English very well, oh yes, you're good. If you embrace anything African or blackness, including how you speak, if it's heavily dominated, if it's more African, oh, it's evil, it's bad. It's you know, Afrocentricity contends that our main problem so therefore it speaks to the idea of agency. The agency that we are taught to embrace is the agency that comes from somewhere else. Of course, we can speak. I mean, Kenyatta said in a previous class something about. Kenyatta had said something about who we are as a people now. I don't remember what I mean with who we are as a people now. What is wrong with embracing European values? European values is ideal, you know. It continues to create a divide within it because we are always going to be seen as black, okay, or African people who need to be fully assimilated within European cultures. But this is important. But again, Afrocentricity contends that our main problem as African people is our usual unconscious adoption of the Western worldview and perspective and their attendant conceptual framework as ideal or as natural. Western worldview as ideal and natural. We accept the ideals to our detriment. We accept these ideals to our detriment. Again, let me say this again. Afrocentricity contends that our main problem as African people is our usual unconscious adoption of the Western worldview and perspective and their attendant conceptual framework as ideal and natural. We accept these ideals to our detriment. And by that, when I say that we accept these ideas to our detriment, we become marginal experiences in the white man's world. That is what I mean, to our detriment. We are marginal experiences in the white man's world, and even to today. Wherever you find black or African people, there is lack. Even within the Caribbean or within African American or post-industrial communities, if you are black and brown, those communities are not supposed to rival white communities. If you drive a fancy car and you look too good, I mean, fine, you should be nice and good, but if once you start to outdo others, the Caribbean, Venezuela not supposed to have all those resources and do better than the US. The moment Jamaica start to do well, that's a problem. Okay? They're supposed to have European values, but they're not supposed to be too rich because black and brown countries are supposed to be marginally rich or a little bit lower than their European or their white counterparts. That is very important to note. We are marginal experiences in the white man's world, and we still are. It doesn't. If you look the Caribbean today, and I said to people, what is it that separates Haiti, Cuba from Trinidad and all these other countries? Haiti and Cuba took their independence. These other countries, we ceremonially accepted our position. If you took your independence and created your own idea of the nation, that is a problem. That is a problem. And they use debt, dependency, CIA invasion to outduel you. Call you terrorist. Certain countries should not dominate the Middle East. Okay? certain countries should not dominate. And if it look as if that if it look as if a brown country is becoming too modern, as if that they'll develop the capability to defend themselves, that is a problem, and they call them terrorists and bomb them up. That's the idea of power. They redefine the thing for what it is not. They are terrorists, and then that's a justification to bomb. They redefine African people as evil, not having religion, as property, and then they want to enslave them and then destroy any history that speaks, that challenges that challenge that. They don't have religion. Everything is evil about them. Obi and all that evil, and they give you institutions that will help you to feel like that about yourself and to adopt foreign religion. Yet that Afrocentricity contends that our main, I said, life is what you make it or what you allow others to make of it for you. Yet life is about people and how we relate. Life is about people and how people relate. Life is about people and how people. Life is about people or how people relate. Okay, within that dynamic, that's very important. So, Afrocentricity contends that our main problem is, as African people, is our usual unconscious adoption of the Western worldview and perspective and their attendant conceptual framework as ideal and natural. We accept these ideals to our detriment. And by detriment, we mean marginal. We are marginal experiences in the white man's world. We thus are lost in madness. We must reorient ourselves. That is the idea of that Amazama is trying to perpetuate here. We are thus lost in madness. We try to bleach our skin with all kind of stuff. Okay, we look down on Rastafarians. We do not embrace revivalist culture or the revivalist religion and church. We see it as not as weird, as too black, and nothing black no good. But we are black. The challenge is our liberation. Our liberation rests, and this is the argument that Amamazama is putting forth in the Afrocentric paradigm. Our challenge is our liberation, which rests on our liberation rests on our ability to systematically displace European ways systematically. It is system driven, it's systematically displaced because our adoption of European ways is systematic. So our ability to displace European ways of thinking has to be systematic. Systematically displace European ways of thinking, being, feeling, and replace them with African ways. In other words, with African culture. How do we do that? If you look at how do the Chinese people do that who live here in America or in Canada? How do they do that? How are they able to preserve their culture? In one sense, of course, I'm going to talk about in next week class how we have preserved our history and how we can continue to do so, and what the challenges are. But the key idea here is epistemological centeredness. Epistemological centeredness. How we know what we know. A framework driven by a frame of reference. That's what I was talking to you about Kenyatta when we says, no, it's really talking about a frame of reference. We really don't have to go back, but as a frame. How? Because, the Chinese are here. They still remain Chinese even in America. Or in Canada, wherever you are. But so the key idea is epistemological centeredness, a framework driven by a frame of reference where phenomenon are viewed from the perspective of the African person. It centers on placing people of Africa in control of their history. So now we start to rewrite history, rethinking history, and doing research to find out about our culture. That's why it's so good to read Diop talks about African civilization, Kimani Nohushi from Temple University teaches a class. He's from Guyana, and he teaches a class about African civilization. And I took a course on African civilization, and boy, let me tell you, at first it was difficult for me because I've come with all my European education, from the best schools, and Georgetown University, and University of Penn. University of Penn is one of the 6 top universities in the U.S., one of the Ivy Leagues. You're bringing my education from there, from UWI, from JTS, from Georgetown that looks at Greek, the foundations of Western civilization, looking at it from the perspective of Greece. I bring all of that into my African civilization class at Temple, and boy, I was like, wow, I felt like I was white. But I'm white. I said, wow, I know nothing about Africa and African civilization and the importance of Africa. But all the other students in the class were a little bit better. They were they knew about Africa and and the father of the gods and mother of the gods, and there's no distinction between fathers and mothers were just as leaders as women were just as leaders as men were. Okay, but in ours, it was quite interesting, and it was just interesting learning about. We're not going to be doing that in this class because I'm not going to be revisiting that, because you have to do a course in African civilization, and so you can do that. But in this class, we're not going to do it. But start reading about not from the perspective of the European, what they think about Africa, but there are people who are writing about Africa. Okay, and how they live and how they worship, and how some of our practices and some of the stuff that we do subliminally is tied to that, and how we speak. Kenyatta was able to pick up that with interactions with others, and we start saying, "Oh, but it becomes so interesting." It's very important. So this class I begin this class a certain way, but we're going to move away from that to start to considering other things. But I had to do that. As an intellectual theory, Afrocentricity is the study of the ideas and events from the standpoint of Africans as key players rather than victims. Key players, because all we have, when you study your social work, when you study your psychology, you're learning about Sigmund Freud, another European. Do you know about Frantz Fanon? Or any other very important figure? We're all we're African people, black and brown people, but we are always learning. But the perspective comes from Europe. Have you ever thought about that? What is wrong with Africa? Oh no, nothing black no good. Education and learning and anything will come from Africa. It's black, so therefore that no good to you. Don't think about that, okay? Afrocentrism is about Africa asserting itself intellectually and psychologically, so as to break the bonds of Western domination. I used to live in Hillshire Heights, or in Johnson's Hill in Jamaica, Johnson's Hill, Hillshire, and there was a guy with a family, and they used to have a lot of African pictures, and they were so steep into African traditions, and I thought they were weird. Honestly, I thought they were weird. I'm like, they're so weird. All these these black stuff and Rastafari was the closest that they had, because Rastafarianism, and they were so, as much as there were drawbacks with Rastafarianism, but they really did a lot in terms of researching African culture and learning about Africa. And the reference for Rastafari is Africa. They focus on Africa as the center instead of Europe. And so as a young boy, which is my friend, I would say my friend's family, they're so weird. Why are they weird? I was weird in a sense, I'm thinking about it. But I was thinking, wow, everything is about this black thing. But I'm black and I'm looking down on my own blackness. That's why we talk about this idea of madness. I said something about madness earlier. We thus are lost in madness. Afrocentricity is about African asserting itself intellectually and psychologically so as to break the bonds of Western domination. The main category of thought is that culture, shared perceptions, attitude, and predispositions that allows people to organize experiences in certain ways. And this family in Hillshire, they were trying to organize their experience in certain ways. They embraced their African self, they embraced their hair a certain way, and how they organize and live. They were very, in terms of how they eat, because how we eat is everything was very important. We were very, one thing about the African is this conscientization. They were conscious as a human being. And, and so it was quite interesting and powerful, Africans, one thing about Afrocentricity that Amma Mazama drives home is that Africans appropriate their own experience as a challenge to European nationalism and its power structure. Africans appropriate their own experience as a challenge to European nationalism and its power structure. Institutions is part of the power structure. When the Jamaican government decided to have a open discussion about Obia, the church objected to it. When part of the institution that's created to continue to maintain a European consciousness. In this sense, the aim is, so again, Africans appropriate their own experience as a challenge to European nationalism. There's also the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which is older than the church the idea of church and the practice of church. It's good for us to start learning about this Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which is an older version of church. Anyways, Africans appropriate their own experiences as a challenge to European nationalism and its power structure. That's Afrocentricity. In this sense, the aim is to give us our African victorious consciousness back. So that's important. Now, there are misunderstanding there's some misunderstanding or there's a myth about Afrocentrism, which to be Afrocentric is to be African, and is to be African and affected by oppression. But white South Africans could claim to be Afrocentric based on that definition. But to be Afrocentric stresses the importance of cultivating a consciousness of victory as opposed to oppression, and that's very important. As opposed to be Afrocentric stresses the importance of cultivating a consciousness of victory as opposed to oppression. Choosing particular aspect, Afrocentric there's something else that I wanted to share about some myths about. Next week I'll share the myths about Afrocentricity. The purest form of Afrocentrism places Africa as its center, the source of the world's people and most fundamental ideas and inventions. Not necessarily so. That's a myth. That's Russell Adams. When we talk about Afrocentricity and Afrocentrism, don't think about it in the sense that, because remember, there's a difference. Afrocentricity is not Eurocentricity. Eurocentricity is very dominant. It thinks it is the purest form. Eurocentrism imposes itself as universal. Okay? And it's the only way of seeing the world. That's Eurocentrism. That Afrocentrism does not purport to be dominant in the sense that it is the only way, and it does not impose itself like Eurocentrism. Afrocentricity respects that all people have a perspective that stems from their center. Afrocentrism demonstrates that it is only one way to view the world. It is our way to view the world. It's not the way. Eurocentrism says that it is the way, the truth, and the life. No man cometh to the world except through Eurocentricity.
So I have a question.
That's a very important point I just made. Just so you know, it's a pun. Okay. Go. No. Okay. Yeah. Go ahead.
How long is break again?
Oh,
Because it's no.
we're gonna take a 15.
8:30.
No, we're gonna end the class. Do you want me to end the class at 9:45 and then that's it?
Yeah, just go through the
No,
curriculum.
sir, not 9:45, 8:45.
8:45. Sorry. All right. Okay. We're gonna end and then. Go ahead.
Outline, please. Just take the next 15 minutes to go through the course outline.
Oh, we haven't done the course outline. Oh my God, I forgot about that. What? You guys couldn't remind me?
You got excited, so we just let.
Oh my God, yes. Okay, fine. And I wanted to talk about Karenga, the cultural African characteristics and the characteristics of African culture. But fine, yeah. So we'll stop there for now. But I hope you guys get the gist of Afrocentricity and the Afrocentric paradigm. Very important as you begin to study Caribbean thought. As you begin to study the Caribbean philosophically. Okay. Where's your reference? Now, in terms of, let's now look at, let me see if I could find the course outline here. Is this the course outline? Caribbean current